Good afternoon. This is Dr. Nelson Garias, Stratford University, School of Health Science. This is MED230 Medical Law and Ethics, Chapter 11. As you can see, my voice is a little bit gone. And I had to do a little makeshift video. I do apologize for it being late, but currently right now there should be notes and a quiz. The quiz will be utilized as attendance for your makeup. This quiz should be performed online on Moodle by this Friday, which is, I believe, the 20th. That's when I have to post attendance for the makeup for Monday, which was a holiday, the 16th. Now, the campus was closed the 17th and 18th, and as you can tell by my voice, I've been incapacitated since then. But I'm going to have enough voice, excuse me, so we can go over the salient features of the notes and of this particular chapter. The first thing we're going to notice is a very famous Tuskegee study regarding syphilis research, and it's pretty much a case study on how not to do research. Got to know why they started the research, know the definition of what is a control group. You can also see within that they actually lied. The researchers actually lied to their patients. They did not offer them info, and even when there was already an actual cure or an actual bona fide treatment for syphilis, they kept on going with the study just to see how far they would go. Now, I'm going to jump to the last part of our notes, the Nuremberg Code, because it's directly related to the Tuskegee research, if you want to call it that. I'd rather call it the Tuskegee incident, and also all the horrible things that that came out of war. And if you look at our notes, well, there was a Dr. Joseph Mengele, and he is famous for doing unspeakable things to prisoners in the concentration camps in World War II in Europe. And he pretty much did a lot of insane things to prove medical theory, because essentially he had no ethics. And without any ethics, you'll hurt people. And essentially that's what he did. And wasn't surprised that he was part of Hitler and the Nazi Party. But if you look at what came out of it, because in Nuremberg, that's where they had the trials, the war crimes, and that's where all the things were listed, especially all of this experimentation. They did on prisoners, they did on prisoners of war, and it's pretty much your worst nightmare. But let's talk about the good things. If you look on page 346, Appendix A of your textbook, I condensed it down into some basic points. All experimentation should have voluntary consent. The subject should know everything about the experiment, what's the function of the experiment, and what's the goal of the experiment. The patient, just like informed consent, just like in consent or when we do treatment, the patient has the right to end the experiment at any time. If the patient feels like they're in danger, or they feel nervous, they can just simply raise their hand or signal that they want the experiment to stop. And that's it. The subject could also, even though they signed the waiver, they could say, well, I don't want to be part of the experiment anymore, even though I did it. They have that right. The experiment should be for the good of society. It should never result in death or injury. The degree of risk should outweigh the risk or the cost to human life. The scientist also has the right to stop the experiment at any time if the above are violated or in danger of being violated. And we're going to be talking about in a moment where many times, especially when we're talking about conflict of interest, that's not the case, especially with big money and big pharmaceutical companies. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. The experiment should be based on animal studies first. And again, we are still just as humane with the animals, and all of these other rules still apply. So if it doesn't work with animals, why in heaven's name should you test it on human beings? The experiment should avoid any human suffering. We already mentioned that. And lastly, it should only be conducted by professionals. Even when I was in graduate school, we had extensive training. We were in graduate school before we can, and also all these permissions we had to go through before we did any experiments on each other or on any test subjects. So that's item number 7, which closely relates to the Tuskegee incident and the so-called syphilis research. Wasn't really research, and we now know that, now that we know the Nuremberg guidelines and how it pretty much violated all the guidelines. So let's now get into the notes. Let's talk about, and you'll see when you look at the notes, item number 2, the bioethical issues and definitions. Just gloss over what is the definition according to the American Medical Association. What's the definition from the nursing code, and what's the definition for the AAMA, which is the body that presides over medical assistance. You'll find that ethics, they have a lot of these items that we're talking about in all of these chapters. There's a lot of stuff in common. So kindly read over those, because that sounds like a beautiful short answer question for a final. Compare and contrast the American Medical Association, nursing, and AAMA, or the medical assisting codes, and you'll start seeing there's a lot that kind of matches. Now let's talk specifically about the AMA. Let's look at page 268. Okay, you'll see a table there, and on this table has the opinions of the AMA. There are not only opinions, there are guidelines where the Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs, which is the punitive arm of the AMA, they're the ones who look into, negligence and malpractice and that sort of thing. So we're going to look at them, go down the issues, and go down the opinions. And actually, many of these opinions are laws. So, for example, abuse. It is the law that if I see it, I have evidence, and that's the key, evidence. Even if I see it, if I'm not sure where that bruise came from, that it could come from other places, and I don't have direct medical evidence, I cannot report it. But once I have direct medical evidence, I must report it to my chain of command immediately. Accepting patients, we already talked about that before, on when can the doctor accept and not accept patients. And one of the places that we can't is, let's say it's not within my expertise. I am not a rheumatologist, so your advanced arthritis is not for me. I have to send you to the rheumatologist. Allocations of health resources. We talked about utilitarianism, and it's rough trying to get everything to everybody. But so a patient advocate, or the person who's doing the treating, shouldn't be making those decisions. And that's where HIM and HCA personnel come into play, because HCA personnel can do the what? Allocating of the budgets. And the HIM personnel, they're the ones who do the data analysis and tell the rest of us, hey, here's the best place we can utilize where the funds can do the best. But again, we already talked about the problems with utilitarianism and how, the outliers, or that one special case, probably won't be served. But the service of the community as a whole will be served. And that's a rough part. They actually outlined one thing that I also talked about in class already when we talked about, remember when we talked about, okay, that one special patient cost me $1 million. That $1 million could help 50 other people. So what are you going to do? Help the one, or allocate those funds to help the 50? And that's an issue and a problem with allocation of resources. Confidential care of minors, we already talked about that. Euthanasia, and which is also related to physician-assisted suicide. The key to euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide is this: we must not deal with what the patient wants. We have to deal with what the patient needs. If the patient wants to die, that is their concern. My need is for the patient not to feel pain. So that should be addressed, not that my patient doesn't want to live anymore. And we will discuss that in more detail in other classes. Fee splitting and financial incentives. Any time that money or extra money gets involved, that becomes a problem with not only ethics, it becomes a problem with the law. So look into fee splitting, look into financial incentives. Happens all the time, underneath the table, but it won't happen on your watch. Gene therapy, we'll talk about that a little bit in more detail, but again, back to therapeutic goals. Not the goal to make prettier kids or to make blue-eyed, green-eyed people. Hitler tried that, didn't work out. We're about therapeutic, helping people get over diseases or to deal with chronic ailments in a better light. HIV testing we talked about at length. Mandatory parental consent, we already talked to that. We'll be talking about abortion as well. Quality of life. Again, it is back to what? Right? It is back to the individual patient needs, not necessarily wants. And it's not the wants of the society or the burden or the financial burden of society or the family. It always comes down to the needs of the patient. Remember, if you focus on the patient and you keep to your higher standard of ethics, you shouldn't go wrong. Withholding or withdrawing life-prolonging treatment. Again, wishes to the patient must be given preference because we have two things in play here. The physician is committed to saving your life and keeping you alive as long as he can. But there is also the quality of life, right? The patient, we talked about that. When those two come into conflict, it always comes down to the wishes of the patient, and that's why it is in the best interest for everybody to get an advance directive so that everyone knows exactly what's going to go down, especially when you cannot communicate. All right. That was the table. There's also another simple list on page 270. Right here at the bottom, table 11.2 of all other ethical considerations. If ever you're going to do any ethical report or any reporting on health bioethics, those are all the nice little hot topics. And if you look at my notes, I got a little bit of extra credit in there if you are interested. Next, biomedical research and considerations. Now, the textbook tries to, let me go to the bioethics portion. It's on page 269. Backtrack a little bit. Bioethical issues. Now, regarding research, the key is informed consent. No matter whether it's the research, there's two types of research. There's general experimentation where we're just trying to go for knowledge, trying to find more, trying to figure out more of the mysteries of science. But then there's, of course, therapeutic. In either kind, you have to get consent, and it must be an informed consent. They got to know everything that's going on. Now, I'll be talking about different kinds of experimentation, but for example, the double-blinded experiment is the experimenter doesn't know, and the people involved in the study don't know who gets what the treatment. Everything gets coded, and but when you explain to them, you have to explain to them that I don't know, or I can't even tell you what you're getting. But somewhere, a third party will know. Because we have to avoid bias. Because it's so easy to be swayed by numbers. It's so easy to be swayed, especially if you know. And I'll talk about more in class regarding the placebo effect. How many times I can give my patient a sugar pill, and I can tell them, oh, this is a crazy, crazy strong drug. It'll do a number on you. And then, so what do they feel? If you've ever been at a party where you give a non-alcoholic beer to somebody, and then they all start acting drunk, well, guess what? It's not that they're a fool. It's because they believe. And remember, we talked about how the mind, because the mindset of our patient is a very strong, powerful tool therapeutically for us and in the medical field. Consent. Know what the control group is. Like in the Tuskegee experiment, the control group is the group that gets nothing. We have ethical considerations there. Remember what we talked about before. Okay, you have a disease, you're part of this experiment, but you get nothing. Therefore, you're going to start to suffer. And remember the Nuremberg Code. It's hard to really stick to it because we have to know the difference between someone who got the drug and someone who didn't get the drug. So the control group is always the group that gets nothing. Or the placebo, which is essentially nothing. It's just a sugar pill. A randomized study, we have to make everything random. I can't pick and choose, because if I start picking and choosing my subjects, like specifically, and also, like who gets what, then, then you'll have some bias there. There are ethics on page 278. Let's jump. I'll be jumping around because my lecture is based on my notes and not necessarily the order of the book. So look on that page regarding the problems with the double blind, the problems with randomized trials, right? Because if you look at there, what's the main problem, right? You start getting into topics of discrimination. Like, why am I choosing this population over another population? And for example, because there are some diseases, such as Tay-Sachs. Tay-Sachs disease specifically is a genetic disease that targets the Jewish population. So in that aspect, that kind of discrimination is a good kind of discrimination, especially in research. But then you could see how there are some ethical considerations. And that's why I always mention the ethical boards always will review, or the ethical review boards, and we're going to talk about them as well. I talked about the placebo sugar pill. Remember, it does nothing versus the actual drug. And the double blind is also on page 278. Now, excuse me, conflict of interest. In research and anything with money, there's a conflict of interest. First of all, the researcher makes their money by doing what? Getting results. How do you get results? Well, because they have to be favorable results. When they're not favorable, they have to be discarded. When you keep on discarding experiments, the people who fund you will lose confidence in you. No research, no funding, no good results. So now you could see that the money that's infused into this will start making people have bias and start making people produce favorable results. That's why do not trust any research that was made by the company that sells the darn drug. Because what is their conflict of interest? They're going to be selling the drug. So of course they're going to be putting everything in a positive light. Right? They're not going to be telling you that you're going to be bleeding out of your eyeballs. Oh no, that's just a rare incident. Pharmaceutical companies, again, we already mentioned. And also pressure from current patients and their families. There are many advocate groups. They are really wonderful. They get a lot of people together. But now in this intense political climate, what do? They go to Capitol Hill and they start pressuring people. They start pressuring the CDC. They start pressuring everybody. And the media also pressures everybody as well. Once the media starts putting stuff about diseases and whatnot, the medical community is kind of pressured to answer. We shall not fall into that. We keep to our ethics, we keep to our guns, and we keep to our protocols. And fine, you don't want to fund my research, there's always somebody else that'll fund it. And that's why many good researchers don't stay in this country, don't stay in other countries, because fine, whatever geopolitical issue there is going on, or a pharmaceutical company issue going on, there's always somebody else who's willing to take a chance on the right thing to get the right answer. Now, let's go to item number 4 in my notes, genetic testing. Okay, let me find that in your textbook. Genetic testing is the Human Genome Project, and that is on page 278. Oh, it's right there. I didn't have to. So this has happened in like the 90s, and they figured it all out by the end of the 90s. And some of my professors, when I was in graduate school, were involved in this. And what is the Genome Project? It is essentially the mapping of everything in our nucleus. Remember, if you took my anatomy and physiology class, Anatomy and Physiology 1, in the nucleus is your DNA. And what's the DNA? It's essentially the blueprint of you, who you are. It has everything about you, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Right? Now, the neat part of it is we mapped it all. We know all the loci or locus, all the places. Like, this is the place for the heart, this is the place for your head. We mapped it all out, but here's the thing, we don't know how to fine-tune it, and how to erase it, and how to make it better. And the original function of the Human Genome Project, which I'm going to dabble a little bit into the cloning issue, is not to clone a perfect human being. That is what the media and that's what laypersons try to do, and also science fiction try to scare us. The reality is, cloning, we are about cloning cell types. Cloning a whole organ or a whole organism, while possible, that is not really the goal. The goal is to cell types. For example, I have a whole bunch of cancer cells that are killing my liver. Why can't I get a whole bunch of cell types to replace it? Healthy cell types to replace that liver damage. So that is the true importance of genetic engineering, the true importance of cloning. And we don't want to make like Star Wars, like a clone army, and that is a distortion of science, and also is not the main goal of scientists in the free world. The main goal of bioethical scientists is to what? Therapeutic. Why are we all in the business of healthcare? So we can take care of people's health, not to create super race, not to create, a blue-eyed, blonde-haired people. Remember, Hitler tried it, didn't work out. A whole bunch of people are going to probably still try, but it won't work out because it's against science and it's against nature. Look at the cloning on page 279. There are a list of pros and cons to cloning. And you can see all the hullabaloo. I totally remember I was in medical school when Dolly the sheep came out, and President Clinton banned research for cloning of human beings. It was like the most ridiculous thing in the world. But again, back to what I was talking about, Ebola and SARS, avian flu. Again, media versus reality. Politics versus the reality. The reality is this cloning stuff is for cell lines. And just because some guy in Scotland did it on a sheep named Dolly, wonderful. It can be done. But remember, this class is not about if it can be done. Should it be done? So let's look at some of the pros and cons. And they are listed on page 280, and I discussed some of them with you. If you look here, there are 3 huge reasons that opponents, people who don't like cloning, use They say that it's going to increase mutation. You know, increased mutation, then we're going to get more diseases. And I don't know, maybe they were watching X-Men way too many times. Maybe I'll start growing claws out of my hands and, you know, start being able to, you know, control people's minds. I don't know. That has nothing to do with the science. Emotional risk. When I read that, I still whose emotional risk? To the cell line that's being closed. Remember, once you understand, it's cell lines, and not actual human beings. And the risk of course, but the last one I must agree with, the risk of abusing technology. Excuse me. You could see how, because of science fiction and science writers, you know, they're very good at displaying the human condition and what human beings are capable of doing. And I could easily see someone taking some of this stuff and totally abusing it. Look what we did with gunpowder, right? We took that to a whole new level. Look what we did with nuclear technology. Instead of making a cleaner and more efficient fuel, we made bombs instead. So I totally agree with the risk of the abuse. Now, gene therapy, which is related. Now, they go through the example of PKU, phenylketourates. PKU is a absence of a single enzyme. I'm sure I shared this with you. And if you have that absence of a single enzyme, it leads to a whole bunch of defects, including mental retardation, infertility, and all this horrible things. And it's all because of what? Of a single base pair. It's a single protein out of nowhere, right? Well, let's think about it. We already mapped the entire genome. We already mapped where all the genes belong. Their loci. Where are they located within that DNA strand? The problem is we don't know how to use it yet. But just imagine the potential. Let's say you have PKU, that I have gene therapy that can replace that absent single enzyme or that absent single protein. Did your child have to live with Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's? Did your child have to live with Down syndrome? And sometimes it's severe. So some of these things, remember, back to therapeutic, right? But there are also other ethical considerations, right? Where's the line crossing? And I even noted it in there in the text and in your notes. When does therapeutics start going into the realm of playing God? Okay? Because there are many, many things that were created in this world for good, but then got out of hand. All right? Another thing that's related, advances in stem cell. We talked about this in class. Stem cells are these master cells. They're not really master cells. They're like baby cells. Because you know when you're a baby, you can be anything. You don't know what the baby's going to be. So, also known as pluripotent cells. That means they can go in any direction. So, if I have a pluripotent cell, I can make them skin cells. I can make them blood cells. I can make them hair cells. And if we knew how to deal with the genome, or the blueprint, which is inside the nucleus, then we could tell the blueprint what to do. We could tell the stem cell, listen, I got a whole bunch of bad heart cells. Could you make me a whole bunch of new ones? Right? So that's stem cell research. The problem that we all talked about is where you get them from. You get them from embryos. You get them from unborn babies. And that opens up a whole can of worms. And there's a list of all the, where do you get this material from. Sometimes we grow it in a lab. Sometimes it's terminated pregnancies. Sometimes it's couples who have excess embryos in vitro fertilization. It's all these sources, but then you ask yourself, okay, where can you get these from? Do I have to have permission? What kind of permission? What kind of legal documentation? It's inundating. So for a lot of people, the best thing to do is just to ban it. Let's not do it. It's too complicated. But let's think about the potential that Dr. James A. Thompson of Wisconsin University figured out when he isolated stem cells. Just think of all the good that it can do. You could solve the diseases before they happen. Especially, and I'm not talking about the preventable ones. The preventable ones I'm always talking about in class. But what about the stuff that hits you from left field? Like aneurysms. You could be the healthiest person in the world, and if in your DNA it says you're going to have an aneurysm, guess what? If the aneurysm bursts, and they burst in a vital location, like in your brain, or in your aorta, or in your heart, guess what? You're dead. That's it. There's no cure. There's nothing. There's nothing you could do about it. But what if we could do something about it? Because how many people have died of aneurysms, and they could have been the next great thing? But we'd never know, because why? They're taken before their time. Harvest spells. Okay, let's now jump to organ transplantation. Okay, where's organs? Organs. We discussed a little bit briefly. Organ transplantation is on page 271. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Organ and tissue donation and transplantation. Now, the United Network for Sharing was established in 1999, and it's the legal part where, they dish out organs. There are also within all facilities that have access to organs. They also have IRBs, which I may or may not have mentioned earlier, but institutional review boards. They have boards that say what's the right ethical thing to do, who should get it, why should they get it, and ultimately, for we already mentioned there's no payment. Everything's on a volunteer basis. The only thing they pay for is the medical care and the subsequent medical care. Now, who gets these things? Well, there are two pretty much basic criteria. There's actually a whole bunch of criteria, but the two basic ones are: one, medical suitability. Are they a match? How good of a match they are. Remember, HLA typing is very, very specific. And even if you're brother and sister, even if you're siblings, you may not be a match. But UNOS or UNOS finds people who are a match. They also have, so is it medical suitable? And also, who's been on the list the longest? Seniority. So it's a first come, first served basis. But again, there's loopholes around this. There's people who get their organs quicker. And unfortunately, reality is money rules. There's ways around it. National organ transplant law forbids any sale of organs in this country. And this also includes any financial incentives for someone. So let's say, for example, you find an HLA type of this guy named Joe. White collar worker, makes nothing a year. But I'm Mr. Moneybags. I offer Joe $1 million for him to give up one of his kidneys. Joe has 4 kids, a family to support. What do you think Joe's going to do? But again, the national organ transplant law forbids that. Okay? Well, that is pretty much, I went through pretty much all the notes, and excuse me that I went fast, but again, my voice is on its last. It's going to take at least a week for this thing to heal up. But again, by that time, it'll be Monday, and it'll be another lecture. So, how it goes is, this is chapter 11 for week 7. Let's move chapter 12 to week 8. And then maybe get into death and dying, chapter 13. So we'll talk about life, death, and dying all next week. And next week we meet week 8 on Monday the 23rd. Alright everyone, please do the online quiz. I'll see you in class. Thank you. Each and every one of us. Now, another thing that you're going to see are these little chemicals here that's sticking out.